And we're back.
And we're back. That's right, you geeks. Welcome into the Echo Screen for the second half of the official podcast of the Clan of the Grey Wolf. I am your host, and I'm not a woman, but my name is the Commodore.
No. Ding, ding.
And it's Rue, who is going to join me in formal attire.
Yes. I
at
figured,
least partially.
I figured since we're going to be talking about indie games, I should be as hipster as possible.
Correct. Now, I did not make that same kind
ironically.
of assumption. However, I did decide to wear a suit today.
Yes. See, you're working for the man, and I'm
correct.
being ironic and cool.
Right. There's nothing ironic about what I'm doing, and everything is ironic about what you do.
That's true.
All right, good.
she's
I just wanted to make sure that was the case. So I'm very sorry, everyone, because you all know that I love you all.
Boo.
But being 30 minutes late for the Echo Screen did rip my heart out. But I am here. I'm here. And we're going to talk about indie games. I heard you talk about PAX East. Did you talk about Max Payne 3?
Mm-mm.
Okay, can I talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I didn't see it, so you go ahead.
Okay, so let me just tell you, my favorite part of PAX East probably was Max Payne 3, which I did play for a while with the Rockstar booth, and it was awesome, guys. Now, I'm not telling you need to go out and get them. I'm just trying to say that, you know, if you're out there, you're in the market for a game, and you don't mind paying full price, in May, you should totally go for Max Payne 3. It was a great experience. I only played about 10 minutes of it at most, and it was just awesome. The way that they do the inventory management, the way that they do the bullet time, of course, which is a natural for Max Payne, everything really, really worked very well, and the story looks just fantastic.
Is it as awesome as The Matrix?
Now, are we talking Matrix the first time I saw it in 1999 in the theater?
How is this 13-year-old mechanic working out in video games now today?
So it's good.
Okay.
It's still really good. Is it as good as The Matrix was that first time I saw it? No, I don't think so.
No.
But it's good.
Now wait, Max Payne.
Yes.
Is that the game based off the Mark Wahlberg movie?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It's actually based right off the Mark Wahlberg. It's actually Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch.
Ah.
Yeah, the Marky Mark and the
Everybody
Funky Bunch movie,
That's
which was called Max Payne. And anyway, that was my favorite part of PAX East, besides the awesome game preservation stuff, which you should totally,
That's true.
if you wanted to go look at the general theme of PAX East to me, which was game preservation, and you can go comment on the Weekly Ringer, which is about it this week.
Ding, ding.
Anyway.
I also talked about the board game documentary.
Shameless plug, perfect, because I didn't talk about that, so that's great.
Yep.
The board game documentary was actually very good.
BoardGameMovie.com. Check it
was
out.
very, very good.
After you go to RetroRareTV.com,
it also
to see
inspired
the PAX coverage.
Yes, it also inspired Rue and I not only to go to Tokyo Game Show,
To go to Tokyo.
but to discover way obscure, crappy games that only we love, to go and make the quintessential documentary about those particular games.
Like Super Mario Bros. 3.
Which no one's ever heard of that, but we would do a documentary that would just take care of it.
Bet you didn't know there was a 3.
It would be like Donkey Kong. No one's ever heard of that until A Fistful of Quarters.
Donkey what?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'd say that.
Anyway, so we're going to talk about indie games. So here we go, right? So one of the things that
You're not Mrs. Rue. There we go.
I'm not Mrs. Rue. I'm not even a woman. I'm not a Mrs. anything. But so first off, we started thinking about questions to really talk about before PAX on the Weekly Ringer. And one of the things that definitely came up was the pervasiveness today on indie games, right? Mm-hmm. And it absolutely, I think, became an important thing for us to look at, because the landscape of video games have changed. Because indie games and the likes of something like Minecraft, Braid,
Mm-hmm.
Super Meat Boy,
Fez, which just came out.
Fez, Snapshot, one of our favorite games at PAX East for the last 2 years.
Was it there again this
Shoot
year?
Many
I
Robots.
didn't
It
even
was.
see that.
Snapshot was
Okay.
there at the Indie Game Expo.
Cool.
As was Shoot Many Robots, which was also very good. Mm-hmm. In any case, they seem to be something of a much more permanent part of the gaming.
There does seem to be a hell of a lot more of them lately.
So the question, I think, really becomes, what is the role of indie games in the future of gaming?
Now, first of all, when you say independent or indie games,
Yes.
and this is something that was brought up on Twitter before.
The tweeter?
The tweeter before we even started. And this is from Mark Carr of Indie Game Searchlight, who is a self-described independent game expert.
A source,
Yes.
when we're going to go find knowledge on indie gaming.
Exactly. He'll drop the knowledge bomb on you.
Correct.
Unfortunately, he couldn't make it here. Something about being at work. What kind of
who
a loser would go to work instead of be here?
Who would know about doing work things
God.
instead of being... Yes.
Anyway. And yeah, Phil Fish is kind of a jerk, but that's beside the point.
Yes.
So he says, indie games, and this is like a series of 10 tweets, indie games never really left.
Just read it all as one successive tweet.
Indie can be applied to a company that produces a game for a bigger publisher like Square, Microsoft, or even Nintendo. The only difference today is these developers don't have the advantage of those large companies publishing and marketing their game. These new devs are left to do it themselves.
Or even forwarding the money to develop these games through a publishing relationship.
Right.
Which happens to be the way most games get made.
Right. And you know what's funny, though, is I was going back over the old, like the initial thoughts you sent me over email
Yes.
a few weeks ago about what
I
to
did
talk
that?
about.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, you did that.
Okay.
And you actually specifically said, I think we should focus on whether indie gaming, from a production standpoint,
Yes.
is more of a fad or a movement within video games.
Yes.
So, when we say indie game, we mean like really independent. Like you have someone or a group or a small company that makes a game, develops it, publishes it themselves. They may or may not make a buttload of money.
Right. Well, and most of them do not, let's face it.
Not everyone is Notch.
No.
No. But or down Periscope.
Down Periscope. Is that what that sound means?
Kind of. Ding ding. But
I may or may not have nautical sounds on my cell phone.
that's true.
Anyway, go ahead.
But you have things like Owlboy, Cave Story, and Braid, as Jim Parsky, whatever, has just
Yep, that's
pointed
good.
out. There are a good number. If you're a gamer of some note, you may not have played all of these famous indie games, but you've certainly heard of them.
Yes.
And think back a decade ago, what indie games really were there? Like independently published, that of any real note. Well, I mean, Cave Story, which really came out, geez, I'm going to butcher this. I'm going to say a little over half a decade ago. I want to say 2004 or so. Mm-hmm. That was one of the first real indie successes of the modern era, at least.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about back in the days, heyday of like the Apple II, where people swapping around
Right.
floppy disks.
Right.
I mean, that was true indie development
The
as
good
well.
old days of the PC gaming era. Yes.
Right.
Gotcha.
But so yeah, this seems to be a more recent phenomenon.
It is a very recent phenomenon, and part of the reason why. Let's talk about that too, right?
Yeah.
So the idea, the record industry has gone through some very similar changes. The movie industry,
Kicking and screaming.
the movie industry even more so has gone kicking and screaming. The music industry has actually been fed very well through indie gaming or through indie music, but the movie industry, I think, begrudgingly embraced the idea.
I just need to point out that we have Mark Carr of Indie Game Searchlight in the chat to
See?
correct all of our problems. ADD at work 23.
Making it.
So he can
Making
correct
it
all
to the
of
show.
our horrible things that we're saying.
Not even close to late. Anyway, the point is, so as video games became so ubiquitously popular,
Sorry, I would also mention that I think TV is being dragged kicking and screaming through this right now.
fair enough. Yep,
But
they're
anyway.
full front, probably 3/4 of the way through the process.
Right.
Point is, video games became so difficult to produce without the backing of one of the big publishers. And by the way, those publishers were becoming more and more monolithic. Mm-hmm. You had
EA.
Square, Enix coming together, right? You had all of these. EA was buying up companies like crazy. Not just companies, developer companies, right?
Yeah.
You had the big companies like the hardware vendors and manufacturers buying companies like Microsoft buying Bungie and Rareware, right?
Activision Blizzard.
Not to mention, and Blizzard is one of the largest developers in the world in terms of the money that they produce from the smallest staff that they've got. Mm-hmm. And so all of these things are happening. Publishers become so much more monolithic. If you decided, you're Jonathan Blow, for example.
Am I?
No, you're not.
Oh.
You're not even close to him. But if you were, You came up with a great idea for a game.
Uh-huh.
Just a fantastic novel idea. A very innovative idea.
Mm-hmm.
How would you go about making that kind of a game back in those days? It just wouldn't have happened.
You mean like in the 90s?
Yes.
That would be very difficult.
It would be extraordinarily difficult, maybe even impossible, by virtue of the technological barriers that were to be had at that point, as well as the financial.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have networks. Now we have mobile gaming, which is really taken over such a big part.
That's something completely different too.
It is different,
because
but my
you
point
have
is
something new every other week.
Yeah, but it feeds into this
Sure.
scenario, because if you don't have mobile gaming taking over with kind of very less expensive, smaller games that take off and sell millions of copies, right? I don't think something like Xbox Live Marketplace, where you can go and buy an independent game for $10, would exist.
Right.
You know, in other words, in the 90s, you want to release a game for Super Nintendo, guess what you have to do? You have to license it with Nintendo. You got to go through a very difficult process. They have to be able to produce it on a cartridge.
Now, forgive me, I forget who this was or what the game was. It was a fairly... In fact, no, I want to say it was like Super Meat Boy or something like that. Someone was porting that to WiiWare.
Okay.
And I think they wound... Or no, I'm sorry, there was a different game. Super Meat Boy didn't get ported to WiiWare because it was over 40 megabytes, so it wasn't allowed.
Aha.
There was another game that was ported to WiiWare, and it took 9 months of approvals
Yes.
before they could even get it on there.
I believe it.
And because it apparently is a big giant hassle to deal with Nintendo getting the stuff on there.
Any of the hardware vendors. It is. So I taught a class in video game development, right? One of the biggest hurdles that I had to parlay upon the students was this. When you go to develop a game, you have to mark off a tremendous amount of time and efforts and resources that are devoted strictly toward licensing your game and producing a game for a particular network or a particular hardware vendor. Because these guys are very interested. They don't want to be Atari.
No.
They want to release games that work very, very well with their system, their hardware, but then their system in terms of their actual network, right? The way that they distribute these games. And if you don't conform to those standards, guess what? You could spend all your life making the greatest game in the world. You don't conform to those standards, you ain't selling your game on their platform.
No, exactly, because they have the ultimate control.
Exactly.
Now, Mark made a good point, or an interesting point. I don't know if it's good, but it's interesting.
Okay.
Let's
not call it bad. I mean...
No, he made an interesting point that some of the 16-bit gems I've been talking about could be considered indie games that just happen to be published by the big names back in the 90s. And that's actually something that Enix has been well known for, at least since the beginning and their early to mid history, was that Enix proper never made a game. They were they had a publisher,
right,
writer,
and they had a shtick
relationship.
They knew what they were doing.
Yeah,
they would take the novel concepts and they would allow them the funding or whatever they needed to get the game done.
Exactly,
and they would publish them.
Dragon Quest wasn't made by Enix. The first 3 were made by Chunsoft, and then there were a few more after that made by a different company, and now they're made by a different company.
Yeah.
But things like Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma were made by Quintet, which really only made a handful of games.
Yeah.
And kind
Although
of
I had to
disappeared.
say that, those are pretty
amazing.
good games. Yeah, those are great games.
But if they didn't have Enix back in the day to publish those games, they wouldn't have the spongulix to get things out there.
Necessary as spongulix.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And I mean, but the concept is still there though. Even so, back then you could produce a game that was more indie, right? But then get published by a bigger publisher. But you still had to fly through all of those hurdles, right? Mm-hmm. That came to putting something on a console, which were tremendously higher than they are today. Mm-hmm. Now, it costs more to make a game today than it ever has in the history of making video games.
Oh yeah,
no question about that.
How much does it cost to make Gears of War 5?
How many millions of dollars? Tens of millions, even.
Yeah. There was someone today. And we're going to get to this a bit in Kickstarter.
Yep.
Who was I reading? It was through Chris Kohler.
Okay.
I was reading...
Chris Kohler's awesome. Chris Kohler, Wired.com. Awesome. Yep.
Yes. But it was through him. I was reading some other article where someone was talking about Kickstarter and how there are a lot of projects out there that if they're not flat out